in that kind of world, in that shape-shifting and that VUCA world, clarity will get rewarded. You want to be very clear about direction, but very flexible about execution. But if you are too hierarchical, if you are too certain, if you are too rigid, if you are too rules-based, you will fail.
Today we're going to think like futurists with Dr. Bob Johansen, Distinguished Fellow at the Institute for the Future. He's a keynote speaker and widely published author, penning The Reciprocity Advantage and Get There Early, Sensing the Future to Compete in the Present. His new book, The New Leadership Literacies, Thriving in a Future of Extreme Disruption and Distributed Everything, is available on September 5th. I'd like to paint a picture for you. You walk into a manufacturing plant and notice something strange. You hear the typical sounds of machines, and you see robotic arms picking up and placing component parts. But what you don't see or hear are humans. There are very few, if any, real live people in the plant, and those that are there are playing more of a maintenance or supervisory role to the machines. Now, this may sound like a scene from a movie or a world far off in the future, but this is happening now. Work is changing. Earlier this year, a Chinese manufacturer replaced 90% of its workforce with robots. Their production increased by 250% and defects decreased by 80%. And that's not all. 40% of U.S. workers now have contingent jobs, such as driving for Lyft or doing odd jobs on Fiverr. And driverless cars, they're going to hit the road en masse very soon. Overall, automation and AI are changing the way companies are run. And if this is happening now, what will the world be like in 10 short years? I decided to sit down with Futurist and Distinguished Fellow Dr. Bob Johansen to discuss how work will be different in the future and what leaders need to do today in order to stay on the cutting edge of these changes.
So last week, I was at MIT with a group of chief human resource officers that were focused on the question of human resources and artificial intelligence. And the examples you gave are examples of what we call signals. So they're indicators from the present that suggest where we're going in the future. And one of my big lessons from being a futurist for 30-some years is that almost nothing happens that's truly new, and almost everything that happens was tried and failed years before. So artificial intelligence has been around more than 30 years now, and it's now becoming an overnight success. So these things take a long time to roll out. And the real question isn't what's new, because if it's truly new, it's almost certainly not going to happen. The real question is what's ready to take off. And I think what is ready to take off is a kind of synergy or an augmentation of human skills and human literacies with artificial intelligence, whatever that's called. I think that's turned out to be a very bad name because it implies that everything that technology is replacing humans, where more likely, and on a larger scale, technology will augment humans. So there will be some replacement, and certainly interesting replacement, but a lot of it's going to be about augmentation. In Kevin Kelly's new book, he talks about how what humans are really good at is asking questions, and what computers are really good at is providing answers. So I think what's happening now in the next decade, as AI becomes practical, what's happening is that it's like we're looking at ourselves in a mirror. And there's some things we can alter and some things we can't. And we're forced into deciding, well, what is it that humans do best? And what is it that computers do best? Computers are really good at large data sets, at looking for patterns. Humans are very good at asking questions and making sense. So the art of the next decade is going to be figuring out how to dance with machines in ways that emphasize the moments when we can be the lead dance partner and kind of let them lead when they do that best.
Right, but where does that leave managers or people who lead teams?
Well, it leaves the leader with the things that the leader can do best. And I think what we can do best is provide great clarity of direction, and we can help figure out what are the right questions to be asking. And since 9/11, I've been teaching and doing workshops with the Army War College, the graduate school of the Army. And the way they talk about it is they call the future a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And the big message that comes out of that with regard to leadership is you want to be very clear about direction, but very flexible about execution. And the visionary leader, is the source of clarity. That's my favorite definition of a leader, is the leader provides the clarity. What machines can do best is to provide execution at scale in ways that humans never could have imagined.
So when you're talking about the VUCA world and a need for leaders to be clear, it seems that for whatever reason, there's so many leaders that get lost in how they communicate with employees. How do they communicate their vision effectively enough with clarity? Some organizations do it well, right? The Apples, the Googles, Facebook, SpaceX of the world. But there's so many companies today that are struggling to understand what that vision is and then how to actually communicate it to employees. So what are some of the questions that they should be asking or asking of themselves in order to be more clear?
Yeah, I think a challenge is to, first of all, kind of see with direction and clarity where it is you want to go and what kind of world you're trying to create. And in the VUCA world, it's almost impossible to do that if you focus too much on the present, because the present is so noisy. I mean, there's so much noise in the present that if you can look 10 or more years out, we find 10 years out is the sweet spot. It's beyond people's normal planning horizons, but close enough in to be practical. If you can look 10 years out and then work backwards, it's much more clear where things are going. So if you're looking 10 years out, for example, it's obvious that we're going to have sensors everywhere. They're going to be very cheap. Many of them are going to be interconnected. Some of them are going to be in our bodies. So that's just obvious 10 years out. And then you work backwards and say, okay, given that kind of world, what's the role? What's the direction that I want to pursue for my company? What's the clarity in that context? That's where leadership resides, is in that source of clarity. But the beginning of it is to accept that it's a VUCA world, not try to problem solve your way out of it, not try to control things, but then figure out what's the direction you're pursuing, and then be very flexible about how you can pursue those directions.
What Dr. Johansen is saying may ruffle some feathers. There are endless articles online that promote doing away with future strategic planning. They say you should focus on the here and now, or focus on people and culture, and a myriad of other do this instead ideas. But as Dr. Johansen will point out, that's problematic, although it's not easy. I did give him an example of a C-suite leader who wants to be forward-thinking, but gets trapped in the day-to-day fires and plans of the present.
There's always some pressure to do the things you have to do in the short run. But I think for leaders, we're so stuck in leadership that's focused on the present, that's action-oriented. And it turns out in a VUCA world, it's actually impossible to make sense out of what's going on in the present. That's why you need to look longer and then work backwards. So in the tech world, if you want to understand the future of tech, you don't go to CES. It's just too noisy, a Consumer Electronics Show. You don't read Wired Magazine. It's just too noisy. But if you want to know where things are going, you have to take a longer view and you have to figure out the bigger patterns, like the example I gave you with regard to sensors. And then you work backwards from that world. So I'm sympathetic and empathetic with the leader that you talked with. I mean, there's so much pressure on leaders in the short run. But at the moment, if you focus only on action and only surviving, the VUCA world of the moment, you end up getting stuck in the noise, stuck in the scramble, I call it, of the next decade. And it's very hard to get out of that. So while at one stage, maybe if you look back 10 years or 20 years ago, good leadership consultants could say, okay, leaders have to be very action-oriented, and that's the best way to do it. And maybe that works in more stable periods. But in a VUCA world, if you're action-oriented alone, if you're focused on the present alone, it becomes dumb, dangerous, or both.
Ari Wallach is a futurist and the founder and CEO of Synthesis Corp. Last year on the TEDx stage, he warned about the negative effects of focusing on the short term. He cited short-termism as the reason for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill of 2010 that claimed 11 lives, all because someone in upper management only saw fit to focus on the here and now. Now, I know it may sound dramatic, but you'd be surprised how often companies make bad decisions in hopes of achieving a quick win. And they may not intend for bad results, but those results are definitely a threat. Of course, even if you're sold on planning for the future, you have to gain buy-in from others, and convincing the CEO and other executives to provide resources and time for future-focused projects isn't easy.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but I think the way to do that, first of all, you don't predict. In a VUCA world, nobody can predict. Somebody tells you they can predict the future, you shouldn't believe them, especially if they're from California. So the first thing you do is you don't predict, but you do provoke. You create a foresight to insight to action conversation. And that's what my new book is all about, the whole new leadership literacies, is how do you provoke that foresight, insight, action conversation where you bring in, we call it a base forecast, kind of the base of where you think things are going in your industry or in the outside world. And then you do scenarios off of that. And it's futures thinking, essentially. So you take that as input to strategy, as input to design thinking, and you create those kind of foresight to insight to action dialogues. And that's where the clarity comes from. The clarity doesn't just happen. The clarity has to come from a series of foresight, insight, action dialogues. And then your clarity can gradually bubble up. But that's where leadership has to kick in. Then a leader has to say, okay, I got it, and here's the direction we should pursue, given that VUCA world, given that series of alternatives.
Okay, I really love this. So in your book, The New Leadership Literacies, you talk about the 5 literacies that they were going to need. And you were touching on the first one, which I feel is really helping leaders to kind of think like a futurist and forecast those likely futures. The second one you talk about is using low-risk gaming spaces to work through concerns and then hone those leadership skills. Can you explain a little bit more about gaming spaces and which leadership skills they need to hone?
Yeah, this is another one that's taken 30, 40 years to be an overnight success. But if you think back to the world of gaming, when I was a graduate student, we used simulation, role-play simulation and gaming. That was the days of SimCity was the first one, the Will Wright game, as an attempt to simulate the world in practice and figure out how to lead in low-risk environments. Well, what's turned out over the last 10 years, or last 30 years now especially, but especially the last 10, is the interfaces have gotten so much better. So the interfaces in today's video gaming world are roughly 10 times better than anything we have in offices, even if we use Macs or the Surface. So the interfaces are so incredibly vivid that we can now create simulated environments. And the military is much better at this than we are in the corporate world. The video gamers are much better at this than we are at the corporate world. We're still playing kind of boring business school simulations, where what we need to do is immerse people in the VUCA world and allow them to practice, because it is a frightening world, and we have to practice in low-risk ways. Now, the good news is we've got a generation of young people coming up who grew up with video gaming. And the threshold I think about and talk about a lot in the book is the 2010 threshold. 2007 is when the iPhone was introduced. By 2010, it was becoming clear that these weren't separate technology tools. They were an ecology of new media. And while I think it's too simplistic to just group them by generation, group these kids by generation, there was a threshold. So if you became an adult in 2010 or later, you are different. So it's roughly those 21 or less in 2017. You are different in ways we don't know we're not clear about just how different you are. But the younger you are, the stronger the effect. So as these young people hit the workforce, they're going to be ready for trying out new leadership styles in low-risk ways. And the environments for this are so much better than we've ever had before. So I'm really optimistic about this generation of young people because they have that ability to engage voluntarily in these frightening environments and then figure out how to lead, how to win anyway.
Okay, so I about choked when he said children who are 12 and younger will be better leaders. I mean, my daughter can spend hours on YouTube watching someone else play Minecraft. And yet, according to Dr. Johansen, she and people in her generation are honing valuable skills.
I think what it's teaching is the ability to immerse, to simulate, to experiment, and to scale as appropriate. So it's teaching what Angela Duckworth calls grit. And her book called Grit, Angela Duckworth, fascinating person. She was a McKinsey consultant and an inner city school teacher. But at Wharton, her dissertation focused on West Point cadets and what made them successful. And it turned out it was a profile, which she ended up calling the grit profile. And it turns out gaming teaches that grit, that kind of grit. And I think the challenge for parents is how can we go there with our kids and learn with them? Because there's aspects of grit that they now know better than we do because the interfaces in the gaming world are so much better. And I think what parents have to do is go there with their kids and guide them in terms of making intelligent and safe and moral choices, but also realize that the kids are going to know things we don't, and we can learn from our kids too. So I think the challenge for parents is not just to limit screen time, or screen time is really quite an old-fashioned measure because 10 years from now, everything is going to be a screen. So the real question isn't the screen. The real question is, what do you do through the screen? And the fact is, kids are better at playing in these environments than we are, and we need to learn that from them. We also have a kind of wisdom. I call it the wisdom game. We can play the wisdom game, and maybe anybody over 40 or over 50, we have license to play the wisdom game, but you got to get in the game with the kids somehow, and we got to learn from them at least as much as they learn from us.
Okay, so now I feel lost because if I'm not one of the cool kids that's under 21, so what about we people in our late 20s, early 30s that are caught between wisdom and actually being really cool?
Yeah, that's a real dilemma. I think the challenge, each of us has our own voice and our own strengths. I used to think in terms of age cohorts. My PhD was in sociology with a focus on sociology of religion, and I was taught stratified random sampling. But it turns out that in this VUCA world, the categories that we used to stratify by are just no longer static, they're fluid. So people are different things at different times. And this whole idea of cohort analysis where you say, oh, the millenniums are like this, or oh, the Gen Z, or oh, the Gen X, or the boomers for that matter, it's just too simplistic. So I've given up on that. But I do think there was a threshold, roughly 2010, where digital tools became digital media. And that affected different people differently. If you were, in general, young people, kids become adults between age 13 and 15, depending on the kid and depending on the culture. So if you became an adult in 2010 or later, you are different. We're just learning how different. And the younger you are, the stronger the effect. That, I think, we can say with much more certainty. The grouping by cohort or by age grouping, I've just given up on that. I just find it's too simplistic.
So to kind of ask another question about just the whole gaming spaces, are there organizations right now, since schools aren't doing it, are there organizations that are actually immersing their people in the VUCA world just to simulate and help them hone their leadership skills?
Yeah, I've got a couple of chapters. The way the new book is structured is I've got, for each of the 5 literacies, a definition chapter that describes the literacy as it exists now, and then a futures chapter, which describes where it's it's going. And the examples I talk about now are in the military, they're way ahead of us, as I said earlier, in terms of realistic simulation. I got to visit the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert, which I describe as the world's largest video gaming parlor. It's about the size of the state of Rhode Island, and it has real tanks and real helicopters and real Afghan actors. And people play war games there for 2 weeks, 24 hours a day. Most people lose because it's designed to be harder than real warfare. Many people are killed without having to die. Very instructive and life-changing. So the notion is once you get to real battle, God forbid, you find it easier than Fort Irwin. That's the kind of model we're going from. Now take that over into the video gaming world. The company that I've seen that does this best is Electronic Arts, and you would expect that. I mean, EA is one of the largest game designing company, but they've got a guy, Andy Billings, who kind of set up their EA University effort, and they practice what they preach. They use gaming as part of the way they prepare their leaders for the future. So I teach there now, and I've learned a lot from how they do that. I haven't found any company that does this consistently across the whole company. I have found pockets that do it very well. Also true in universities. I haven't found a single university that covers across the whole university, but there's pockets at places like Stanford and Carnegie Mellon and MIT that are doing great things. And I think they're ready to scale over the next decade. That's the exciting part.
As Dr. Johansen pointed out, the military is great at creating gaming spaces, which is the second of his 5 leadership literacies. The third is lead shape-shifting organizations where you just can't tell people what to do. Dr. Johansen goes on to explain.
So the underlying forecast here that I would say is now inevitable, the underlying forecast is anything that can be distributed will be distributed. And this all goes back to the origins of the internet, which it turns out has followed an arc roughly like the arc of my career. I began my career just as the internet was becoming public in the early 70s. And what drove it was the core technology of packet switching. And that was the technology that allowed centralized networks to become not just decentralized, but distributed. So the inventor, Paul Barron, who I got to interview, he was one of our founders, what his challenge was to create a network that would resist nuclear attack. And what he created was packet switching, where if any portion of the network went down, the rest of the network would continue to exist because of these packets, which break things down through the network, but then reassemble at the other end. But Paul did not call it packet switching. He originally called it hot potato routing. And that's where we are now, hot potato routing. So the next generation of the internet is going to scale in ways we haven't scaled before and apply this anything that can be distributed will be distributed principle through hot potato routing. And that's going to force the creation of organizations that I call shape-shifting organizations. So they're essentially organizations that have no center, grow from the edges, can't be controlled, and hierarchies come and go. So we already have hints of that now, but unfortunately, the criminal economy does this much better than the rest of us. The terrorists do this much better than the conventional military. So we're all going to have to learn how in this world of shape-shifting organizations, you can lead. And that gets us back to the notion of clarity. The way you lead in these shape-shifting organizations is, again, very clear about direction, very flexible about execution. And the military has this whole language about it. They talk about
Dr. Johansen and I go on to talk about the 4th and 5th literacies. The 4th states you must learn to be a dynamic presence even when you're not there in person. Now, this is especially important for leaders who have a challenge with distributed teams. Now, according to Bob, there are companies whose founders are dead, yet they still seem very much alive. Think about Walt Disney or Sam Walton, for instance. So if they can lead from the grave, surely you can lead from an air-conditioned office. Now, the final literacy requires leaders to keep their energy high and transmit it throughout the organization. To keep up in this volatile world, leaders need physical, mental and spiritual energy, or what Dr. Johansen calls meaning making.
A leader has to have a sense of meaning, a sense of grounding. I think all great companies have a sense of grounding, a sense of meaning that then permeates the brand. And here's the essence. If you look 10 years ahead, the future we're moving toward will reward clarity, but it will punish certainty. So in that kind of world, in that shape-shifting and that VUCA world, clarity will get rewarded. You want to be very clear about direction, but very flexible about execution. But if you are too hierarchical, if you are too certain, if you are too rigid, if you are too rules-based, you will fail, because that kind of future will just wipe you out. You have to be very clear, but not certain. And here again, the neuroscientists help us understand this. There's the wonderful work by Robert Burton, which says that certainty, when we feel we're certain about something, it's the part of our brain, the same part that governs love and anger. So we think in many cases that we're being very rational, but we may not be. And our brains kind of trick us. And certainty feels comforting, but in a VUCA world, it's anything but.
Well, you definitely gave us some things to think about, so thank you so much for stopping by. I'm definitely looking forward to picking up your book, The New Leadership Literacies, on September 5th. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this interview with futurist and author Dr. Bob Johansen. Definitely pick up his book, The New Leadership Literacies, Thriving in a Future of Extreme Disruption and Distributed Everything. The book will be available for purchase on September 5th. Also, I've put together a free futurist worksheet that will help you think and plan like a futurist by outlining your 10-year plan. You'll find the link to the worksheet in the show notes, or you can go to themanilafolder.net/futurist. Thanks again for listening. I'm your host, Casey Jorgensen, and this is The Manila Folder.